So what I'm going to talk to you about now are 7 different varieties of form. And the reason I'm going to talk about 7 is because what I really want to get across is the intimate relationship between form and content. If you change the way that the order in which you tell a story or the way in which you tell a story, you're going to change something fundamental about the content, about the sort of thematic material that you're delivering. So let me try and talk through each of these 7 forms with some examples, and hopefully that'll become clear. So the first form that I want to talk about is really the most straightforward, and that's just what I call forward, just moving in a straight line chronologically with no particular embellishment or ornamentation. The Three Little Pigs example that Nancy gave is a great example. Many folktales are great examples of just straightforward structure. There's no jumps away to B stories. There's no sort of rhetorical flourish at any point. Really, really conventional, straightforward way of telling a story. The second structure that I want to talk about I call forward with wells. And so it's sort of similar to the forward structure, but we have these little jumps away to something else. And that could be a jump away to a B story, that could be a jump away in time, maybe to a flashback or a flash forward. So it's adding a little bit of texture, it's adding a little bit of interest, it's adding a sort of layer of complexity. This is one of the most common forms that you're going to find in Western literature. We see it in film, we see it in the novel, we see it in short fiction. It's endlessly flexible and is used over and over again. So if I was going to take the Three Little Pigs and adapt that and make it a sort of forward with Wells story, I might choose to begin at the point where the wolf is knocking on the door of the first little pig's house. And we'd have the little pig freaking out, thinking, what do I do, what do I do? And then maybe we have a jump back in time to him at the hardware store buying the straw to build his house. And now we jump back forward again and he's realizing, oh crap, that was the wrong decision. And then we can you can see how we could proceed forward that way with the Wells, jumping back and forth, which is going to really up the narrative tension throughout the story rather than telling it in a very straightforward way. The third structure that I want to talk about is backwards. And backwards, it's just the reverse of forwards, right? Well, no, not exactly. It's actually formally a whole lot more elaborate. And I always tend to joke with my students, kids, don't try this at home unless you have a really, really compelling thematic reason why you need to use the backwards structure. The great example of this that I always point to is Martin Amis's novel Time's Arrow, which is told from the point of view of a parasitic intelligence sort of living on the shoulder, if you will, of this character and watching his life unspool backwards, almost like a cinema reel going backwards. So things like eating and going to the bathroom, as you can imagine, are very, very confusing. But it also becomes a really potent way of looking at issues of memory and the corruption of memory and loss, and that's sort of the whole metaphor of looking backwards at one's life, looking backwards at a narrative. Unless that's the story that you really are trying to tell, I would say don't approach the backwards narrative just because you want to show off how smart you are and use a very fancy structure. It really has to intimately suit the material that you're telling. If I was going to relate this to the Three Little Pigs story, perhaps we've got the third little pig, the one who saves the day, right, in the brick house in old age, sort of looking backwards and sort of thinking through, you know, where did this story really begin for me? And maybe when we go right back and we spool right back to the beginning of the story, it's him in mom's house. And so maybe it's something about his relationship with his mom. Maybe he blames his mother for everything that has happened since, for that initial kicking him out of Eden, you know, kicking him out of the utopia of the Barca Lounger and the big screen TV in mom's house. So maybe this ends up being a very Freudian story if you do it that way. It has less to do with the wolf. It has probably less to do with the other siblings. It becomes a very different story. So the next structure that I want to talk about is the spiral structure, like that. And we see this used very often in murder mysteries, for instance, where a certain set of events is being revisited again and again and again, and we're seeing the same scene perhaps told multiple times from multiple different points of view. And it can be really effective at sort of getting at what we can and can't share as conscious human beings. A more sort of highbrow example of this would be Kurosawa's film Rashomon, right, where we have an event that happens in the woods. A couple are waylaid by a bandit, and we see the story told 3 times from each of the characters' points of view, and they're completely irreconcilable with each other. They each have completely different understandings and memories of what the event in the woods was. And so it's saying something very profound about the sort of limits of human understanding and the limits of how we can understand each other. If I was going to talk about this in the context of the 3 Little Pigs, perhaps it would be telling the same set of events, the visitation of the wolf, from the point of view first of the first pig, and then the second pig, and then the third pig, and maybe they have completely different understandings of what has gone on. Maybe the third pig says, oh, that first pig, you know, with the straw, what was he thinking? He's always been a dunce. And the first little pig is thinking, well, I was trying to save money to give to mom for her retirement because she's not actually that well off, you know, buddy. You know, you're always so selfish thinking about yourself, think about other people. Like they could have different versions accounting for the same set of events, and that would really be a story that would be saying something about, you know, irreconcilable sibling yearnings or something like that. So again, it would change the story slightly. The one caution I have with the spiral structure is be careful that you're not putting that as a label on something that's just a big hot mess, where you just haven't sort of figured out what the story is. You're sort of going it from all angles at once, and you're telling the same scenes again and again because you haven't decided which draft you like the best. That's not what this structure is for. If you want to say something about different human understandings of the same set of events, if you want to talk about how, you know, we can understand the same thing from different angles, like kaleidoscope turns, thematically, that's what you want to use the structure for.